The fight for Defend the Guard just exposed exactly how deep the corruption runs. National Guard generals spreading lies, senators pulling backroom deals in real time, and deep state operatives like Kevin Payne doing everything they can to kill the bill. We've got the footage, we've got the receipts, and I'm going to break it all down clip by clip, lie by lie, so stick around because we're not going to let him get away with it. It was a proud moment for Arizona when Senator Wendy Rogers, the prime sponsor of the Defend the Guard bill, once again stood before the Military Affairs and Border Security Committee in the Arizona Senate to make the case for this critical legislation. This marks the third attempt to pass Defend the Guard in Arizona after it successfully cleared the Senate twice before. But it was stonewalled in the House by Representative Kevin Payne. I want you to remember that name. We're going to talk about him later. Senator Wendy Rogers is a proud patriot, a veteran of the United States Air Force, and one of the most principled America First legislators in the entire country. She is fearless. She is unwavering in her oath to the Constitution of the United States. And in this hearing, she made it clear that our military should not be used as a tool for undeclared foreign wars. Yet, once again, we saw the usual tactics from those who oppose Defend the Guard. The opposition came armed with nothing but thinly veiled threats, misleading arguments, and outright lies, all designed to keep the legislative branch of government in check and maintain the status quo. But we're not going to let them get away with it. Today, we're going to break it all down clip by clip, argument by argument, lie by filthy, dirty lie, so that the American people can see exactly what's happening behind the scenes. I'm just going to let you watch the full introductory statement from Senator Wendy Rogers as she presents Defend the Guard to the Arizona legislature for the third time. Once again, it's already passed the Senate twice with unanimous Republican support. And now she's back again. This is her fight. This is our fight. So check it out.
Mr. Chair, members, I first introduced Defend the Guard legislation in Arizona 3 years ago. I did so because I recognized that our country could not survive on an ideology of invade the world, invite the world, conducted in violation of the United States Constitution. It was a perversion of our sovereignty and good government, allowing our country to be invaded while our military was used as a tool to invade others. Arizona was on the cutting edge of the Defend the Guard movement. The Arizona Senate was the first legislative chamber to pass it in the United States. And now the rest of the country is catching up with identical bills being introduced in over 30, that's 30 states this year. SB 1495 will keep the Arizona National Guard out of undeclared foreign wars. In obedience to Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution and recognition that our southern border is the most important national security interest our nation has. This bill will help restore the balance of power among the branches of the federal government and incentivize the people's elected representatives to reclaim the war powers granted to them by our founding document. We now have a Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who supports this legislation. We now have a Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, herself an Army officer, who supports this legislation. We now have a Director of the National Counterterrorism Center who supports this legislation. With SB 1495, we will make good on our legal and moral obligations to our Arizona National Guardsmen by guaranteeing that before they put their boots on the ground in combat overseas, Congress will have put their names on the dotted line and have voted to send them there.
All right, great introduction by Senator Wendy Rogers. Thank you, Senator, for doing such a great job. Now we're going to get into the opposition, namely Brigadier General John Conley, who is the only person to show up and testify against this bill. You're not going to believe some of the things he says. Let's break this thing down.
Sir, please state your name for the record, and you'll have 2 minutes.
Thank you. General John Conley, Arizona National Guard. Mr. Chairman, distinguished body, thank you for the time to express our concerns, the National Guard's concerns with this bill. My primary concern with the bill is national security. Our president, current president, has stated that the foreign policy of this country is to promote peace through strength.
You know, I find it odd that when we think of national security now, we think of sending our primary defense force, the National Guard, away from the homeland to the other side of the world for months or even years at a time, or in the case of the global war on terror, for 24 years. How is that national security? How is that strength? But I'll tell you what, General, you and I actually agree on one thing. I also believe in a policy of peace through strength, but not the way that you do. This bill deals with undeclared war. We're talking about here peace through a demonstration of strength. And what demonstrates strength better than a robust, well-trained, well-armed military that's used as a scalpel, not as a sledgehammer? Strength is using our forces when necessary, when our homeland is threatened, not to meddle in the affairs of other nations in some ill-defined peacekeeping operation.
The National Guard writ large represents 40% of the combat arms of the United States. 40%. You're not going to win many basketball games playing 5-on-3.
General, we're talking about war. We're talking about life and death. And you want to compare war and the risk of war to a picnic activity, to a basketball game. You know, I think he actually used this analogy in a legislative hearing to try and dumb down the complexities of military engagements for the civilians in the room. Think about that for a moment. He's talking down to your representatives.
And I'm not sure why we would want to hamstring the president and say, we're not going to allow you to use the Arizona National Guard, or refueling tankers, for example. We're not going to allow you to refuel planes in the Indo-Pacific region because we want to make a statement that we need Congress to declare a war. Congress hasn't declared a war since World War II. It's not going to happen. But the dangerous thing is, if we allow the state of Arizona to be the first state to look the president in the eye and say, no, sir, I'm not following your order, they're likely going to take all of our equipment away and our money.
Oh, there it is. That's the money shot. General, let's be honest. Nobody is suggesting that we hamstring the president. The Defend the Guard legislation does nothing to limit the president's ability to respond to real-world emergencies anywhere in the world. The president already has at his disposal the active duty military comprised of the Marine Corps, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Space Force, and the Coast Guard. He already has the federal and constitutional authority to deploy them for real-world emergencies and threats as needed. But you see, a prolonged engagement, one that might require the use of the National Guard, the Ready Reserve, is not an immediate emergency. That is something that must be debated and authorized by Congress because the Guard is not a standing army. It is the reserves of the states. This bill doesn't hamstring a president. It restores constitutional balance that has been eroded for decades.
General, for the previous 2 sessions, your office has voiced concerns over federal funding. In the past 2 years, have you discussed this legislation with the National Guard Bureau in Washington?
All right, check this out. The general's response, it is classic misdirection. This man is a political creature. He doesn't want to answer that direct question, so he dodges it.
Senator Rogers, the National Guard Bureau is against it. The National Guard Association of the United States is against it. All 54 commanding generals of the 54 states and territories against it. The Enlisted Association of the National Guard of America is against it.
Senator. General, yes or no?
Mr. Chair,
General.
Senator Rogers, yes.
Mr. Chair, excuse me, General, what are the names, titles, and ranks of the officials you spoke to who informed you that they would support defunding the National Guard in response to this bill.
Boom, there you have it. Now she's got the general on the ropes.
Senator, with respect to the individuals in the National Guard Bureau, I have not spoken with the chief of the National Guard Bureau about it, but I can tell you that federal law would require that our funding be taken away. It's not discretionary on the part of the chief of the National Guard Bureau or anybody in the National Guard Bureau or the Secretary of the Army or the Air Force or the President of the United States, frankly. If we do not use the equipment, the federal equipment and the federal funds that we've been given to be the primary reserve, combat reserve of the Army and Air Force of the United States, then that would be a violation of federal law because Congress gives you money for the purpose of doing a certain thing or things. It's called the Purpose Statute, Title 31. And the Purpose Statute makes it illegal to not do the thing that you're supposed to be doing with the funds and the equipment that you're given. So it would get taken away from us. And it would be given, this fight's still going on. I mean, China's still there, Russia's still there, right? North Koreans are still there. That's all of our stuff is going to go away and it's going to go to somebody else. And it's probably going to be the active components.
Wow, what an absolutely illogical and incoherent argument from the general. Let's break this thing down a little bit. Federal funds and equipment provided to the National Guard of the states are appropriated for readiness and training. It ensures that Guard units are properly equipped and disciplined to serve in lawful missions, whether that's state or federal. However, these funds, these resources are not provided with the expectation that the National Guard or their members will be used for unconstitutional, undeclared wars or any other illegal purpose. The purpose behind these appropriations is to support the Guard's dual role, assisting in state emergencies and defense and supplementing federal forces only when lawfully mobilized. Passing Defend the Guard does not violate the Purpose Statute, which, by the way, is 31 U.S.C. 1301A if you want to look it up. It simply ensures that federal activation of the National Guard aligns with the Constitution, specifically when Congress declares war as required by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. In contrast, using the National Guard for undeclared foreign wars is a real violation of the constitutional intent, an expansion of the executive war powers beyond the legal limits. The federal government, not the states, is the one stretching the purpose of the National Guard appropriations by treating state forces as a standing army for overseas conflicts without proper congressional authorization. Withholding funds and equipment from the state for enforcing constitutional constraints on National Guard deployments is not fiscal responsibility. It's political extortion. And let's be clear, this threat is not coming from Congress. It's not coming from the Pentagon or any federal agency willing to put that in writing. It's being manufactured and pushed by careerist National Guard generals acting as political operatives, not as neutral military advisors. These generals do not control appropriations. They are mouthpieces for the National Guard Bureau, a bureaucratic entity funded by taxpayer dollars with zero direct authority over congressional funding. Their goal isn't to uphold any law, but is to intimidate state legislatures into submission with vague and baseless threats. If withholding National Guard funding were a legitimate and enforceable consequence, some named federal official, somebody with actual authority over appropriations would have issued a formal directive. But no such directive exists. Instead, we get a whisper campaign from politically ambiguous generals eager for that next star on their collar. And while we're at it, let's talk about how do you get that next star on your collar, General? It's by being a good boy, by being a yes man, and serving the general above you or the politicians overseeing your career advancement. These generals are not upholding military law or the Constitution. They are carrying water for unelected bureaucrats who fear losing control of the National Guard, but more importantly, they fear losing control over their bloated budgets that come with it. No one in Congress, not a single person, not the Department of Defense, not that even the National Guard Bureau has put their name on this supposed funding cut because it has no legitimate basis in law or practicality. This isn't about appropriations compliance. It's about intimidation, pure and simple.
Congress is the body which appropriates the budget, including funding for each state's National Guard. In addition, there are multiple laws, we talk about the law, you and I, such as the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, which provide legal reinforcement by prohibiting the executive from withholding appropriations designated by Congress. Do you agree? Here is my question. Do you agree that an action as drastic and politically controversial as defunding the Arizona National Guard would require an act of Congress?
Mr. Chair, Senator, yes, and it's already been passed. It's been on the books for decades. It's called 32 U.S.C. 108. And more recently, that authority was given to the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Air Force, the Secretary of the Army, and the Chief of the National Guard Bureau in 32 U.S.C. 105A8. So those laws already exist. They already give the President and the Secretaries the authority to take our stuff if we're not using it for what we're supposed to be using it for.
Oh my, General. We're going to talk about it, but since you brought it up, and thanks for doing so, let's talk about Title 32 U.S.C. Section 105. Section 105 outlines the federal financial support for the National Guard, specifically regarding funding and the accountability of federal appropriations given to the states for operations and maintenance of the National Guard units. The key provisions in 105 state that the federal funds for the National Guard come through the Secretary of Defense to the states or the territories or District of Columbia for the pay, training, and administration of the National Guard. These funds exist to maintain readiness and operational capability in accordance with federal standards, and they must be used exclusively for those purposes. Once again, these funds were appropriated for pay, training, and administration of the Guard in relation to readiness and operational capability, not for mandatory overseas deployments and undeclared wars. The general is playing a shell game. He's moving things around, misrepresenting federal statutes to confuse the issue. The argument that Title 32 U.S.C. Section 105 would be used to defund a state National Guard for passing Defend the Guard is misleading because the legislation does not restrict, redirect, or misuse any federal funds at all. It simply sets conditions on when the Guard can be deployed to overseas combat. And just so everybody's clear, overseas combat falls under Title 10, not Title 32. General Conley also mentioned 32 U.S.C. 108, but we need to clarify what 108 is. This is a statute that gives the president the enforcement mechanism for states and their National Guard who fail to comply with other sections of Title 32 U.S.C. It allows the president to withhold federal funding if a state fails to comply with the regulations in Title 32, not if a state refuses to deploy National Guard under Title 10 without congressional declaration of war. This is another dishonest conflation.
Mr. Chair, General, follow-up to that. I don't believe any member of Arizona's delegation, Republican or Democrat, would allow that to happen. Is it the estimation of your office that Congress would vote to defund a state's National Guard out of retaliation for a policy disagreement?
Mr. Chair, Senator, I can't remember the year, but probably 5 or 6 years ago now, over the objection of all of our members of Congress, our Apache battalion was taken away from the Arizona National Guard. So can it happen? Yes. Has it happened? Yes. Very recently, it's happened.
Oh, General, you didn't bring your best today. Let's talk about the Apache helicopters, the AH-64 Apaches from the National Guard in Arizona. Several states lost their Apache helicopters, but not because they passed some policy that the Department of Defense and the National Guard Bureau didn't agree with. Congress wasn't acting in a punitive way, not at all. The helicopters were moved because of changes in mission scope, modernization, and upgrades to our weapon system. The Apache helicopters were transitioning into the Delta and Echo models, and they were taken away from several states, including Arizona, Idaho, and Utah. Modernization of battlefield assets is a normal process. Equipment is rotated, reassigned, and upgraded, and it's constantly evolving our force structure plan. There's not a single state out there, by the way, General, that still has their horses from the Mounted Cavalry Day. And those weren't taken away from Congress because they were punishing a state. They were taken away because modern warfare evolves. You, General, are a master manipulator. You are playing a shell game here. You're trying to deceive the committee and the public, but the facts don't lie. You do.
Since we now have a new SecDef, Pete Hegseth, and of course President Trump and DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, and we have Hegseth to head the Pentagon, has your office contacted the Department of Defense to ascertain his current views on the Defend the Guard legislation?
You know, that seems like a pretty logical question from Senator Rogers. Absent of anything more relevant or recent, I think we need to lean on what we do know from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. Let's see what he had to say about Defend the Guard.
The New Hampshire House, New Hampshire State House, has passed a bill that would require the United States Congress to declare war before deploying the New Hampshire National Guard. Quote from the bill real quick reads as follows. Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution vests the Congress with the exclusive power to declare war, and by abdicating the war powers to the executive branch, the United States Congress has failed to follow the United States Constitution and the intent of the founders, Pete.
This caught my eye. It's a really interesting development. Right now, this is New Hampshire only, and New Hampshire is simply pointing out that it's supposed to be Congress that declares war. It has become an executive branch function, and as a result, unless the Congress declares war, New Hampshire doesn't have to send troops for foreign wars. To me, it makes a lot of sense. I spent most of my career as a National Guardsman, deployed multiple times with the National Guard to foreign wars. We got used to the idea that state National Guard are part of expeditionary forces, which is not traditionally the use of a National Guard. And so this is New Hampshire saying, we don't trust how the federal government's going to use our troops, so we're willing to commit them when the American people, through their elected branch in Congress, commits those troops to a foreign war. Then you can. I love this idea. I'm sure the National Guard Bureau is, oh no, again. I love states exerting their influence through a system of federalism, and the idea of protecting the prerogative of why are we sending some young guy from New Hampshire to the eastern province of Afghanistan when you have a northern border problem or floods that happen in New Hampshire and they're not there to be able to provide support for that. Yeah. It's an interesting development. It'll be interesting to see whether other legislatures do this and how the military reacts to it.
But why are states having to tell the federal government abide by the letter of the Constitution? I love it as well, but it's an unfortunate state of affairs when the states are having to say abide by the text.
No doubt.
Has your office contacted the Department of Defense to ascertain his current views on the Defend the Guard legislation?
Mr. Chair, Senator Rogers, I have not. I'm fairly certain my boss has not either. But I've seen that clip. I've seen that clip of Secretary Hegseth. Maybe his perspective was that at the time. I understand what he said. I think if we did speak with him, and I don't have that kind of juice, but I think if we did speak with him, I think he'd have a different perspective on it now. Right now, Secretary Hegseth has Arizona National Guard in the Sinai Peninsula trying to keep peace between Israel and Egypt and others in that region. Right now, Secretary Hegseth has National Guard members fighting ISIS in the Middle East, and we all saw what ISIS can do. They just ran over one of their sympathizers just ran over a bunch of folks in New Orleans, so we know how dangerous they can be.
All right, General, let's evaluate that statement real quick. If the National Guard can fight ISIS in some shithole country in the Middle East or Africa, or defend their homeland and the great city of New Orleans from an ISIS attack, which one do you think would be most important? Which one do you think would be most preferred by the member of the National Guard? Which one do you think would be most preferred by the people of New Orleans? Shouldn't the National Guard defend America first? I'm just going to let that one sit there for just a few minutes. I don't think it requires any more conversation.
And if I may say one last thing, this bill, as written, doesn't just prevent the National Guard from engaging in war. This bill prevents the National Guard from even training overseas because it prevents the National Guard from using instrumentalities of war, from engaging in any duty. That's what it says. Any duty that uses an instrumentality of war, a plane, a ship, a Humvee. Those are all instrumentalities of war under by DOD definition. Even a rental car. If I'm using a rental car for a military purpose to get from A to B, that becomes an instrumentality of war under some circumstances. This bill would prohibit us from training overseas, operating overseas, and it would, just the training part of it is dangerous to the 8,000 Arizona guardsmen who will not have the opportunity to go overseas and train with those countries who they may have to fight a fight with. God forbid Congress ever does declare war.
Mr.
And
Chair.
I think that putting our folks, our 8,000 folks, in a position where they're not even allowed to train to fight a war that we're asking Congress to declare is inappropriate.
That's simply not what the bill says, General, and I think it's disingenuous of you to cast it that way, especially for non-military colleagues of mine here. And when you do that, it makes the rest of your testimony, with all due respect, General, less than credible.
General, once again, you require some corrective action. Because you're being flat out dishonest. You are lying, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. I'm going to have you go ahead and stand there at parade rest while I talk to you for a minute. What the bill actually says from the bill says this: for the purpose of this section, active duty combat means performing the following services in the active federal military service of the United States: participation in an armed conflict, performance of hazardous service relating to an armed conflict in a foreign state, or performance of a duty through an instrumentality of war. Again, the section clearly states, as an instrumentality of war in active duty combat. It does not say the National Guard cannot use an instrumentality of war. Let me repeat that. It does not say that the National Guard cannot use an instrumentality of war. Your words. It simply says it cannot perform an active duty combat through or as an instrumentality of war. Words matter, General, and the words you're choosing to use right now are not appropriate. You are being dishonest, and you know it. But the words I'm going to choose to use right now are these. You're not very smart if you believe the things coming out of your mouth. Let's define what an instrumentality of war actually means in the context of this bill. The Department of Defense defines an instrumentality of war as an object, condition, or action uniquely related to combat or military efforts during a time of war. The Defend the Guard Act aims to prevent the National Guard unit from being deployed into active duty combat without a formal declaration of war by Congress as required by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Your argument that the National Guard wouldn't even be able to train because picking up a weapon or driving a military vehicle in a training exercise would be deemed an instrumentality of war, it's once again completely dishonest, General. Shame on you. And don't think that I forgot about your little training argument. Let's talk about that. Training outside of the continental United States for the National Guard is already protected by the Constitution, federal law, and the United States Supreme Court. Title 10, U.S. Code, Section 12301F, which is known as the Montgomery Amendment, states that governors cannot object to the purpose, place, or reason for the National Guard to be called into federal service if they are going outside of the continental U.S. for the purposes of training. This has already been decided in the landmark Supreme Court case, Perpich v. Department of Defense. And General, since we're having this little school session, let me fill you in on that case. The majority opinion, written by Justice John Paul Stevens, ruled unanimously 9-0 that Congress has the constitutional authority to deploy the National Guard units overseas for training without requiring a governor's consent. However, this ruling only addresses training. It did not establish that governors were prohibited from objecting to combat deployments in undeclared wars. That remains crystal clear. No gray area whatsoever. Congress has the authority to declare war, and a congressional declaration of war is required before the National Guard can be activated under Title 10 to fight overseas. General Conley, you are using broad misdirection, dishonesty, and an attempt to confuse a matter that is as clear as black and white. There is nothing in the Defend the Guard Act that would prohibit the Arizona National Guard from training or fighting and winning America's wars, but they must be wars that are properly declared. For 80 years, we have moved away from this clearly defined constitutional authority. And the fact that taxpayer-funded lobbyists like yourself marching into legislative hearings not to offer insight, but to act as lobbyists, offering conjecture, opinions, and thinly veiled threats. Well, that speaks volumes.
I'm just saying. Finally, could you explain the legal authority underpinning the United States war in Syria for the past decade? A conflict which has included the deployment of thousands of National Guardsmen into conflict. There's been no declaration of war. 2001 AUMF does not apply to Syria, and no invocation of the War Powers Act.
Senator, first of all, Senator, I just quoted the exact language, the direct language, instrumentality of war. We can't perform any duty using an instrumentality of war. You can look up the DoD definition of instrumentality of war. You don't have to take my word for it. With respect to the constitutional underpinning, the preamble to the Constitution says that Congress will provide for the common defense. Article 1 of the Constitution says that Congress shall provide for the common defense. Article 1 of the Constitution says that Congress has the power to raise an army and maintain a navy, raise an army. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to enact laws that are necessary and proper to carry out its other powers. So when the Congress decides that it's in the best interest of the common defense to take part of the army, whether it's the National Guard or any army, to take part of the army and use it to go to Syria or elsewhere for the common defense, it has that authority. It has that constitutional authority. It has the authority to write a law that says the president can do that with so many humans for X number of days or whatever it is. Those laws are necessary and proper for Congress to implement its constitutional authority to provide for the common defense and raise an army under Article 1 of the Constitution.
Wow. What a generally incoherent ramble. General Conley's response was a perfect example of someone who was trying to overwhelm the discussion with broad constitutional references while deliberately ignoring the specific constraints that limit those powers. He leaned heavily on the phrase common defense, but what he failed to address is federal laws, constitutional provisions, and military regulations that define when and how the National Guard can be federalized and deployed into combat. So let's help him out. Let's start with the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, which allows Congress to call forth the National Guard for three purposes: to execute federal laws, to suppress insurrections, and to repel invasions. None of these legal frameworks support the idea that Congress can simply lump the National Guard into the broader concept of the Army and send them wherever it pleases without a declaration of war. The general also tried to invoke the necessary and proper clause, which he butchered horribly. This allows Congress to pass laws necessary to execute its constitutional powers, but it does not override the requirement of a formal declaration of war before activating the National Guard for combat. And finally, let's talk about Syria. The 2001 AUMF was passed to authorize military action in Afghanistan after 9/11. Syria was not part of the conflict. There has been no congressional declaration of war, and in fact, when President Obama asked Congress for authorization to intervene in Syria, Congress told him no, and yet he went anyway. And guess what? At the end of that conflict in Syria, well over 50% of the boots on the ground are from the National Guard, not the active duty military. So, General, while your entire response was a masterclass in evasion, Senator Rogers saw right through it. Okay, now I really want to address what's about to happen next. We're finally going to hear from a Democrat, statist, globalist hack on the committee, Democratic Senator Catherine Miranda. Check out this little ditty.
Mr. Chair, General, first I want to make it clear that there's no confusion with non-military members listening to this testimony. I'm going to go straight to the common sense part of this, and my question is twofold. First of all, are you worried about the risk of losing your funding? How is it going to affect your funding and resources? And the other question is, can individualized guardsmen refuse to answer the call of the president?
Thank you, Democratic Senator Catherine Miranda, for reading the prepared question that obviously the general or one of his staff members provided you. The general went on to answer Senator Miranda's question by spouting off about how many hundreds of millions of dollars Arizona gets from the federal government to ensure that the National Guard can be sent to fight and die in overseas wars. His words, not mine. He then tried to tie together a massive red herring. But since he brought it up, let's talk about the border for just a second. one of the 3 constitutionally enumerated roles of the militia or the National Guard is to repel an invasion. And Arizona's former attorney general issued a formal opinion several years ago that what was happening on the southern border was, in fact, an invasion. And what did your governor do? She ignored it. Governor Cartel Katie Hobbs did send the National Guard down to the border, but not for the purpose of having long rifles pointed south to keep the invaders at bay. No, she sent unarmed, uniformed guardsmen down to the border acting in an administrative role, expediting the illegal border crossers' claims of asylum. She wasn't repelling the invasion, she was aiding and abetting one. But regardless of Governor Hobbs' complete dereliction of duty, sending the Guard to the border is an authorized mission for which the Guard exists. The federal government would never strip their funding for actually doing their constitutionally mandated job. And by the way, Border Security General, I'm sure you know, is a Title 32 mission. Defend the Guard Act has absolutely nothing to do with Title 32 missions. I feel like I need to keep saying this for the troublemaker sitting in the very back row. That's you, General. You are blurring the lines on purpose. It actually takes an amazing feat of mental gymnastics to be able to sew these crooked lines because they're not even close. They're not even parallel. And to address the question about individual guardsmen being able to say no to a direct order from the president, of course, an individual cannot refuse a lawful order. The Uniform Code of Military Justice, Article 92, states that failure to follow a lawful order is a punishable offense.
Can an Arizona guardsman say no? No, not unless they want to be charged under the Uniform Code of Military Justice for Article 92, failure to obey a lawful order. Once the president says you're going, the switch is flipped. We take a dual oath. We take an oath to be in the National Guard of Arizona. Simultaneously, we take an oath to be in the National Guard of the United States, which is a separate federal entity. So when these kids take that oath, and I've taken that oath, and the president says you're going, and you say no, you have just violated an order from the president of the United States, and you could be prosecuted on the Uniform Code of Military Justice for it.
Okay, General, your fear tactic game is a little bit weak. First of all, UCMJ compliance requires obeying lawful orders. We don't disagree. But which is lawful? Deploying and fighting in a war that has not been declared? Are you suggesting that soldiers should be charged under Article 92 for obeying an unlawful order or disobeying a lawful order? It's kind of two sides of the same coin. We are not asking not one single guardsman to disobey anything. We are clearing the path so that there is no disagreement. We are simply saying that the federal government has overreached and misused the National Guard, and we are going to clearly define and close the loopholes that they've been driving Army tanks through for the last 80 years. There will be no disobeying a lawful order because the lawful order will come from a declaration of war before the Arizona National Guard is sent to fight in overseas wars. This bill does not affect any one single person individually, nor does it instruct any single National Guardsman to disobey any orders. The law is a legislative prohibition requiring the governor to take all necessary actions to keep the National Guard from being federalized unless there is proper authority. General, you are really good at scaring people with misdirection and dishonesty. But the people that you're actually scaring in that committee, and there's only a couple, I think they're dimwits, so it doesn't actually take much to do it. All right, that was the end of the general's testimony, but don't check out just yet because we need to talk about Kevin Payne, or as I like to call him, Chicklets. Now, let me set the stage. Kevin Payne does not sit on this committee. He had no reason to be in that hearing, but guess what? Here he is, waltzing in like a deep state errand boy ready to do the dirty work for the National Guard Bureau. For those of you who don't know, Kevin Payne, back when he was Representative Payne, was the chairman of the Military Affairs and Public Safety Committee in the House. And what did he do? He blocked Defend the Guard last year and the year before, each time it's come forward. But he wasn't alone. He had his buddy, Speaker of the House, Ben Toma, right there alongside of him. Well, guess what? Toma's gone. He decided to run for Congress, and we beat him in the primary when he ran against our guy, Abe Hamadeh. But Chicklets is still here. He's doing the same dirty tricks, but this time as a newly minted senator. And what's he doing? Trying to kill Defend the Guard. Right in the middle of the hearing, the cameras caught it. Kevin Payne walks in and he pulled Senator Dunn out into the hallway. Now, Dunn actually sits on this committee. He's inside doing his job, listening to the debate on the bill, and representing his district. But that wasn't good enough for old Chicklets, no. Chicklets had to drag Dunn out and work him over in the hallway, trying to get him to flip, trying to do the National Guard Bureau's bidding, right in full view of everyone. And what happened at the end? Well, you can watch the video for yourself, but the vote was delayed for several minutes. It was held up. Why? Because Payne was running deep state tactics in real time. He was out in the hallway working over Dunn. That's not leadership. That is corruption. The good news is Dunn was principled. Senator Rogers had already prepped Dunn, telling him what to expect, educated him on the bill, and Dunn stuck to his guns. He came back in and cast the deciding vote, aye, in favor of Defend the Guard, to pass the committee and be sent to the entire Senate for a floor vote. All right, now let's talk about where we go from here. There's good news, guys. The bill passed the committee. It's heading to the full Senate for a vote, but we're not done yet. We need your help. We need to let Senator Dunn know how much we appreciate him for standing tall, sticking to his principles, and supporting Defend the Guard. And we need to make sure every senator knows that we're watching. Here's what we need. I need 50 more volunteers to join our phone banking efforts. Sign up at defendtheguard.us/phone banking. Spend just 15 minutes between now and the hearing next week and call every member on the provided list. These are people who are mildly supporting the bill or neutral. I know that we can do this. We can clear the Senate again and send this bill to the House, and then we will go to war in the House and get this thing done. We have a lot of good allies in the House who are ready to take this up and fight. But we've got to get the bill to them first. I want to take this moment and thank the three of you who were there testifying in person: Nathan Madden, Rebecca Massey, and Thomas Deaton. Hey, you guys showed up and you offered your testimony and you made a difference. But I'm going to ask you three to step up again. We need you to help us phone bank. We need you to show up again when this thing goes to the House. But this time, bring some friends. All right, there it is. That's my full commentary on the hearing. We are not done. We are not backing down, and we are going to win. Get involved. Make the calls. Show up, and let's get Defend the Guard passed.